There is a town in Australia that the government does not want you to visit. It has been erased from official maps. Its name has been removed from road signs. The postcode was deleted in 2007, a first for the entire country. Today, only a handful of stubborn residents remain, breathing air that scientists say is still capable of killing them, decades after the last mine shut down. Trespassers who venture into its abandoned gorges are warned that simply disturbing the red dust beneath their boots could plant an invisible killer in their lungs, one that might not surface for another 40 years. This is not a ghost story. This is Wittenoom, Western Australia, and what happened here is one of the most quietly devastating industrial disasters in modern history, one that authorities spent decades trying to keep buried. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Origins, the channel where we dig into the geography, science, and unexplained mysteries hiding in plain sight across this continent and beyond. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe now, because what happened at Wittenoom only gets stranger from here. To understand Wittenoom, you first have to understand the land it sits on. Tucked deep within the Hamersley Range in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, roughly 4,100 kilometres north of Perth, Wittenoom Gorge cuts through some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet formations, dating back more than 2 billion years, layered with rust-red iron bands that give the entire Pilbara its otherworldly, Martian appearance. The gorge itself is a labyrinth of narrow chasms and sheer cliffs, carved by ancient rivers into banded ironstone, with pockets of deep blue-green pools fed by underground springs. It is, by any measure, one of the most visually staggering landscapes in Australia, jagged walls that shift from burnt orange to deep violet as the sun moves across the sky. But hidden within those ironstone bands was something far more consequential than beauty. Running through the rock in thin, fibrous blue seams was chrysotillite, commonly known as blue asbestos, the most dangerous form of asbestos known to science. Unlike the more common white asbestos used in construction elsewhere in the world, chrysotillite fibres are needle-thin, aerodynamically perfect for lodging deep into human lung tissue, and virtually indestructible once inhaled. The Pilbara held one of the richest deposits of this mineral anywhere on Earth, and in the 1930s, that geological accident of deep time collided with human ambition, when prospectors realised the blue rock threading through Wittenoom Gorge could be mined, milled, and sold to a world hungry for a miracle mineral fireproof, heat-resistant, and, they believed, harmless, long before drills touched the gorge walls. This land belonged to the Banjima people, the traditional custodians of the Hamersley Range, along with neighbouring groups including the Yinawangka and Eastern Guruma. For tens of thousands of years, their knowledge of this country was passed down through law, ceremony, and careful observation of the land's moods. The Banjima people did not mind the blue seams. They understood through generations of lived experience that certain places within the ranges carried danger, not framed in the language of chemistry or fibre toxicity, but in the language of spirit and consequence. Elders spoke of areas within the gorge system that were not to be disturbed carelessly, sites where the land itself was considered unsettled, requiring respect and, in some cases, avoidance. Dust, wind, and rock in these specific pockets were treated with a wariness that outsiders often dismissed as superstition. It is a pattern that repeats again and again across Aboriginal Australia, places later proven by Western science to be genuinely hazardous radioactive ground. Unstable rock, toxic minerals were already marked as dangerous in Indigenous knowledge systems, sometimes for millennia before a single geologist set foot there. The Banjima did not need particle physics to know that the blue rock in Wittenoom Gorge was not something to live beside, mill into powder, and breathe in for decades. Their caution was practical wisdom encoded in story, ceremony and law, a form of environmental science built on observation across countless generations rather than laboratory instruments. When mining companies arrived in the 1930s and 1940s, that inherited caution was overridden by the promise of profit. The land was leased, the traditional custodians displaced from decision-making over their own country, and the warnings embedded in tens of thousands of years of law were treated as irrelevant next to the economic promise of blue gold. It is one of the bitter ironies of Wittenoom's story. The people who understood the danger best had the least power to stop what came next. The mine at Wittenoom began serious operations in 1943, run by Australian Blue Asbestos, a subsidiary of mining giant CSR. Almost immediately, workers began falling ill, but the true scale of the horror would take decades to surface. Case won the early warnings. Company doctors documented abnormal lung conditions among miners within the mine's first years of operation. Internal medical reports flagged dangerously high dust levels in the mill and gorge tunnels. These reports were kept internal. Miners continued working 12-hour shifts in air so thick with blue fibre that visibility inside the mill was reduced to a few metres, with no respiratory protection provided. Case to the town that was built on tailings. As the mine grew, a town was constructed to house workers and their families. Nearly 20,000 people would live in Wittenoom at its peak. In a decision that would prove catastrophic, mine tailings, the crushed waste rock laced with asbestos fibrae, were used as free fill material throughout the town. They were spread on the school oval, laid in the yards of family homes, and used to line the airstrip. Children played in it. Mothers hung washing over piles of it. An entire community, most of whom had never set foot in the mine itself, was unknowingly saturated in one of the deadliest substances on the planet, simply by living an ordinary domestic life. Case 3, the closure and the cover-up. By the mid-1960s, plummeting asbestos prices, not health concerns, forced the mine's closure. But the damage was already done and continuing. Government inquiries into worker health had been conducted as early as the 1950s, raising red flags about dust exposure, yet the mine was permitted to operate for another decade, and the town continued to be promoted as a tourist destination well into the 1970s, its lethal history unmentioned in travel brochures. Case 4, the long tail of death. The true horror of Wittenoom did not arrive in the mine, it arrived decades later, in cities and towns across Australia, as former residents and even short-term visitors began dying from mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer caused almost exclusively by asbestos exposure. Unlike lung damage from smoking, mesothelioma can take 20, 30, even 40 years to manifest after exposure. People who had merely visited Wittenoom on childhood holidays, or lived there for a matter of months, began receiving terminal diagnoses in their 50s and 60s. To date, well over 2,000 people connected to Wittenoom have died from asbestos-related disease, making it one of the deadliest industrial legacies in Australian history. A slow-motion catastrophe still claiming lives today. If you're waiting for this to take a supernatural turn, keep watching, because what investigators eventually uncovered about how this was allowed to continue for so long is stranger and more disturbing than any ghost story. Subscribe now, because the cover-up is where this gets even darker. As word of Wittenoom's death toll spread through the 1980s and 1990s, the town understandably attracted a mythology of its own. Some described it online as an Australian death zone, whispering about lingering curses tied to disturbed Indigenous land, or framed the site in the same breath as other so-called cursed locations, places where bad luck seemed to cling to anyone who entered. Urban legend forums speculated about radioactive anomalies in the gorge, or claimed the entire region was somehow uniquely toxic beyond explanation, feeding a narrative that something inexplicable, almost supernatural, was at work in those red cliffs. Journalists, epidemiologists and royal commissions investigating Wittenoom from the 1980s onward found something far more explainable and far more damning of human institutions than of any curse. There was no mystical toxicity to the land itself, no unexplained radiation, no anomaly beyond what geology and industrial negligence could fully account for. What investigators found instead was a well-documented paper trail, internal company memos from the 1940s and 1950s acknowledging dust hazards, medical officers flagging abnormal X-rays among workers, and government inspectors who visited the site and recorded concerns that were subsequently filed away rather than acted upon. The 1991 Royal Commission and subsequent research, including work led by respected Australian epidemiologists tracking the region's cancer rates, definitively linked the extraordinary mesothelioma cluster to crucidolite exposure, not curse, not coincidence, but a known and measurable carcinogen, mismanaged in real time by a company and a regulatory system that prioritised asbestos exports over the lives of workers and their families. Every unexplained death was, tragically, entirely explicable once researchers cross-referenced medical histories with time spent at Wittenoom. The supernatural framing evaporated the moment real data was applied. What remained was a story not of ghosts, but of governance failure, arguably far more unsettling, because it meant no mystical force was needed to create devastation on this scale. Ordinary negligence was more than sufficient. Here is the truth that is, in its own way, more disturbing than any curse. Wittenoom remains dangerous today, not because of anything mystical, but because crucidolite fibres do not degrade. They do not wash away in rain. They do not break down under sunlight. Millions of tons of tailings remain scattered through the gorge and the old town site, and every gust of wind through that spectacular red landscape carries the possibility of resuspending microscopic fibres into the air fibres so fine that a single one, once inhaled, can embed permanently in lung tissue and trigger cancer decades later. This is why the Western Australian government has spent years attempting to forcibly relocate the last handful of residents, offering compensation to abandoned homes in a town it considers unsafe for human habitation, why the town site was formally degazetted in 2007, and why signage throughout the region now warns visitors of the ongoing airborne asbestos risk. The terrifying part is precisely how mundane the mechanism is. There is no anomaly to solve, no force to appease. A community was, quite literally, built out of poison because it was cheaper than buying clean fill. And the same wind that carves those magnificent gorge walls into their breathtaking shapes is the delivery system for a threat that can lie dormant in a human body for half a lifetime. In that light, the caution embedded in Banjima law treating this land, and specifically this rock, as something requiring distance and respect looks less like superstition and more like an early intuitive form of risk assessment, arrived at without a microscope and validated in the most tragic way possible by Western science a century later. Wittenoom is a reminder that the most dangerous mysteries are rarely the ones dressed up in the supernatural. They are the ones hidden in plain sight, in company reports left unread, in warnings from ancient custodians overridden by profit, in dust that looks like nothing more than red earth. Science eventually caught up to what the land's original owners seemed to already sense. The question worth sitting with is how many other places carry warnings we still haven't listened to. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more stories where geography, science and history collide, subscribe to Hidden Origins. We'll see you in the next one.